Well, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year to you. It's been about probably at least 11 days since we've seen one another. We typically, for our family, what our norm, our routine is, and has been for the past 20 years or so, is we run hard with church stuff right up until Christmas Eve, and then Christmas morning we get up and drive out to Rachel's parents, which is in Western PA, and then we sit around and we do nothing for the next week after that, and it's wonderful and everything it sounds like it should be. That trip has changed a little bit over the years in terms of just our kids are bigger now, and so we carry less toys with us, but we carry more people with us, and we've also gotten out of the minivan stage, and so this was the first year we drove two cars, which in my mind it just didn't seem right. But then when you realize you're only dealing with two other people in each vehicle, you're like, this is wonderful. At one point, and with adult drivers, Eli was driving, and I chose to sit in the back seat because Caleb was already in the front seat, and that was fine with me. And at one point, I stopped, and there was complete silence because everybody was listening to their own thing, and there was no conversation for about 2.5 hours, and it was wonderful. It was just a completely silent car. Now, the other car that had Rachel and Desi and Isaac, I'm sure, was not silent for very long in the midst of that, but just had a great time just kind of disconnecting. And, I've mentioned this through the years in just various different illustrations or stories about my family. My parents passed away at 60 and 61, and within a year kind of us moving back to New Jersey. And I like Rachel's parents, and they're great people, but I think also it was a priority for us, kind of being the only living grandparents in our kids' lives, is just to go and to spend as much time with them as we could, and that's been our practice over the years. And so we had a great week and came back. And so for me, it's like I leave here at the end of Silent Night, and I come back, and it's January. And I feel like there's, in that 11 days, probably for most of us, there's some level of downtime and some degree of just disconnect, but then it seems like a switch flips and it's January and we're back to whatever it is lies in front of us, or the new us that we want to be, or the things that we let go for a few weeks that now we got to pick back up, or the things that we should have been doing that we weren't doing, or whatever it is. January offers us that kind of reset. And you can talk about it in a number of different ways in terms of, just the calendar turning over, or New Year's resolutions, or, just it's time to start doing your taxes, or whatever it is. There's something about January that just kind of switches the narrative of what's going on inside of our lives. It's a time of reflection, and now with social media and even, Spotify or different things, it'll give you kind of the year in review and tell you this is how you spent 2025. These are the pictures that you took. These are the songs that you listened to. These are the memories. Sometimes we do that in other ways, just in personal conversations. And in the midst of that reflection, coming through Christmas and starting a new year, the question remains, is a God who stands outside of time, has the ability to enter into time, but also speak into time, does he desire to do kind of a new thing inside of our lives? And so on Christmas Eve, one of the things we talked about, and I just want to tie back into this because I think it kind of, carries forward. And, so even though there's red and green there, we asked this about Christmas, but I think the same God is still active inside of our lives now. Is there room inside of what you're anticipating for God to still surprise you? And is there room inside of your expectations for God to do the unexpected? So that, there's a sense of anticipation, but yet we still have the capability for God to surprise us. There's an expectancy for what God can do and will do, and yet we haven't boxed God into saying, if you really love me, if you're really there, you're going to do these things in this order. Is there still room for God to do the unexpected inside of our lives? And so we enter that time of the year where we make New Year's resolutions, and we buy gym memberships, and we purchase plastic totes to get better organized, and we throw out some things, and we get new day planners, and maybe you don't do any of that, but there's something about the idea of time turning over and switching over that we want to talk about a little bit. So let me ask you this question in regard to what is the Christian's relationship to time? It's kind of an odd question. When I think of what is your relationship with time? Trust me, I've been in meetings with some of you. You have no relationship to time whatsoever. You kind of just, you and time have always been, at it, and, it seems like, time usually wins, but, and then some of you are just completely bound. You and time have a wonderful relationship. You are in lockstep because everything, is like clockwork. But beyond just your minute to minute or your, whether you're on time, punctual or not punctual, what's the time for you that it seems like you best think in terms of? Do you set goals for the year? Do you look at a particular month? Do you say, what are our priorities for this week? What do I want to do today? Or what's the next 5 minutes of my life look like? If there was an optimal time setting that you would say, I think best and plan best in this block of time, what would it be? And it's different for all of us. And maybe for you, you would say I do a little bit of all of it. I try to set some yearly goals, and then I look at the month ahead. But the reality is we stand in relationship with time, and whether we realize it or not, it either brings joy, clarity, structure to our lives, and or it brings some level of conflict, shame, guilt, regret into our lives. This thing called time and how we relate to time inside of our lives. So as you know, and I'll just give you a brief history, I don't know a whole lot about this, but even what I do know, we don't really have too much time to talk about today, but just a brief history of kind of calendars. There have been a variety of calendars throughout history. A lot of different cultures in the ancient world particularly had their own separate calendars. It's kind of been simplified and codified during the year, and the calendar that we use now, mostly referred to as like a Gregorian calendar, begins with the idea of January as the new year. It was interesting for me to look at, that the decision for January to be New Year's Day, because you could really start the new year at any point that you wanted to, was very much a government decision. It was the Romans who said, really the start of the year had kind of, in a lot of calendars and a lot of cultures, been the spring. Because in the spring is when the agrarian year starts, when you begin to plant, when you begin to focus on what's going, the new life that's coming, that's beginning. And so it would make a lot of sense in terms of how the rhythm of our world looks for the new year to be, say, in March. And a lot of calendars were that. In addition, and you've read this inside of Scripture when it says, say, for instance, in the story of David and Bathsheba, in the springtime, when kings went off to make war, David stayed at home. Spring was also a time of what are going to be the new conquests, whether they be military conquests or building of roads or clearing of areas. And so it was the Roman government that said, we need to start kind of the reset of the new year in January to get our officials in place, our people in place, our money in place, to do the things that we want to do in the new year, which begins kind of in the spring. And so it was very much a practical government decision to say, we're going to make, the first of the year January, so that we can be up and running when things really begin to get started for us in the spring and then move through, and we can kind of do this reset in the winter. The Jewish year, New Year's Day, Rosh Hashanah, occurs and is very much linked to the Day of Atonement. And those two holidays kind of occur that when you think about the fact that God makes atonement for our sins, there's a newness that begins to happen. Now, all this might not be of much interest to you or not, but just to say that there is something inside of us that is geared towards saying, we don't, even though time is linear, there are also seasons, there are also cycles, there are things that happen where things kind of begin again, and you get a chance to say, all right, now there's a fresh start with what lies ahead. I'm going to encounter a lot of the same things, the same seasons, the same people, the same obstacles, the same challenges, but today could be a new day. Today could be a new year. That for a God who stands outside of time, who is writing a story that transcends time, what's it look like to take this next segment, of 365 days, and to say, what is it, for God to do a new thing inside of my life, but also if God's redemptive purposes are living through me, what's that look like for me inside of this next calendar year? In the midst of the seasons and the cycles and the days and the weeks and the months and all that, how do we offer God our time? There's verses inside of the New Testament that talk about God, making, redeeming our time in Colossians chapter 4, or, that we can make the most of the time that we have in Ephesians 5. And I think that's the cry of every heart, is to kind of do the best with the time that we are given in the midst of that. In Genesis 1, God created the heaven and the earth. And in the midst of that, one of the first things that's created was day and night. That God, one of the first things he fashions into existence is the clock and the calendar and the sun and the moon and the very structuring of our days. And so if you want to look at the handiwork of God, you don't just look at the fact that he creates men and women in his own image, or the beauty of creation, or the animals, the mountains, but even the structure of our day and the structure of time. Even though God stands outside of it, it's one of the things he creates for your good and for our use and for his redemptive purposes. So I want to turn our time for just a couple of minutes before we take communion together in a book that is sometimes not viewed as being overly spiritual. If you've read this book much, you probably only know about 2 or 3 different sections, one of which I'm going to read for you today, so we're not jumping in, but it's probably a book that's one of the least read inside of Scripture. So the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, again, probably some of the more familiar words in a book that's relatively unfamiliar to us. You'll know these words, if not from Bible study, at least from listening to the radio 45 years ago or so. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. In this back and forth, and again, the poetry of that kind of rings out, but if you were to say, all right, what's the spiritual component of this, especially when you read word like a time to hate, and you would think, when I read the rest of my Bible, there doesn't seem to be, would Jesus say that there's this is your period of time to hate, and then after that, we're going to love everybody, okay? So make sure that you make the most of your small time that you get to hate, because after all, we got to love most of the time. Now, I think what the writer is saying here, and this is why we don't spend a whole lot of time in Ecclesiastes, because, the writer, most, likely Solomon here in this case says, inside of this complexity of life, sometimes we live in this mixed bag of just these seasons of life that life throws at us. A time for everything, a season for every activity under heaven. There's, a time where we're born, and a time where we die, and a time that we're at peace, and times it seems like we're at war, a time where we're building up, and a time where it seems like everything's crumbling. This is not so much prescriptive in terms of this is how you build your life. This is Solomon being descriptive of, when I look back over my life, this is what I see. And I think all of us, if we were honest and you kind of go back and you were to kind of take the film strip of your life and you would look at it and say, you know what, when I looked, there was a time where it seemed like God was uprooting us, and there were other times where God was planting us, and there are times where it seems like things were being gathered, and other times it seems like they were being scattered. And you go through this, and you start to think, all right, life happens inside of these seasons that I don't always understand, and I don't even usually recognize what's happening until after the fact, realizing what was taking place. The complexity of life. Well, Solomon's not going to make it much easier on us, because then from there it sounds, again, probably another verse that is not anyone's life verse hanging on your wall. Verse 9, what do workers gain from their toil? In other words, you work so hard, what do you get for it? And he says, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. Thanks a lot, appreciate that. Hang this on your wall, give it out as a bookmark to people. But again, this is not so much, Solomon being prescriptive as far as, this is how you build. But when I look back over, there's a burden that comes with the fact that it seems like in this complexity and adversity and the toughness of life, sometimes you wonder, where is it getting me? Where is it all found? Where's it leading to? Where's God in the midst of it all? Tim Keller talks about, the book of Ecclesiastes, and really, going through it brings you to the point that says, if I can't depend on God, where else can I depend? That when you read through a book of Ecclesiastes, it says, unless God can show up and step into time and space inside of my life, life is at best just a mixed bag. But if God shows up, he can bring redemption to the chaos. So all that leads to this, and I wanted to read all of that, time to mourn, time to celebrate, all that through, all this hard work, what's it for? God's laid, I've seen the burden God's laid on the human race. All that precedes this next verse. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Solomon, what are you getting at? You've just gone through, there's this, as I look back over my life and the film strip of it, there's all these different things, and there's hatred, and there's love, and there's gathering and scattering, and there's building and tearing down. There's this weight, that it seems like we carry through life, but then you're going to say God has made all things beautiful in its time. And I think, again, according, to, as Tim Keller said, what Solomon's maybe trying to say here is, in the midst of it all, when you stand outside the timeline of your life, God was bringing beauty out of ashes, writing a story that I couldn't see. And there might be a few things that I have questions about, but I don't know if I would change a thing when I see the story that God has written and what he's done. And he's placed eternity in our hearts. Maybe that's why, Augustine, when he says our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Or when C.S. Lewis talks about, that until, you find that first love, you'll continue to chase all these lesser loves. Part of that even has to do inside of time, that our hearts, even though they're wired to the calendar and the demands and the things that are going on inside the day-to-days of life, your heart beats according to a clock that is not the clock that you live by on a daily basis. Because God has placed eternity in your hearts even as you live in a world that is finite and broken, rushed and hurried. God's placed eternity inside of your hearts. Just because Ecclesiastes is kind of a weird book, I'm going to continue to read because you would think that kind of sums it all up. But he continues on and he goes right into, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God does it so that his people will fear him. So even after saying, that God has, written eternity inside of our hearts, he makes all things beautiful in our time, Solomon says, I don't know, maybe the best thing to do is to eat good food and, and drink and just have fun with the people around you and just, do all this, recognizing that God oversees it all. And again, that's why people shy away from Ecclesiastes, because it seems like there's, verses like meaningless, all is meaningless. And then there's, he's made all things beautiful in its time. But I think he wants to just sit down in this complexity of life and says sometimes we don't always understand what's going on, but we know who has written time, who stands outside of it, who's speaking into it, and God's redemptive purposes in the midst of what is going on around us. That the one who is timeless stepped into time, and he still continues to bring redemption to the time that we have. And so I want to just give for you, kind of three obvious levels, but this is, I think, kind of what we can begin to think through inside of our life when you look at how God works in terms of how he's created, but how life works best also, and where is it that God wants to bring a level of clarity or insight or maybe a challenge to us at this new year. I think for us, there's, at the very basic, there's the day. And you could get more basic, there's the hour, there's the minute, but I think each, when you put your feet on the ground in the morning and give thanks to God that that he's brought you through another evening, there's a day set before you, there's an opportunity that each new day brings. There's no question, though, that as we live each day, we also find ourselves living inside of seasons. Not all days are created equal. Sometimes you find yourself in a season that is bringing challenges to you that regardless of the energy that you awake with that day, you still find yourself in the middle of a certain season that might be awesome, it might be challenging, it might be awful. But the good thing about seasons is that they come to an end. Not every season lasts forever. And what about this idea that God has written eternity inside of our hearts, that we live in light of an age and a reality that we don't necessarily see inside of our day-to-day life? So the day, this is where life is lived, this is where goals are set, this is where habits are kind of formed or continued inside of the day to say, what is it that God has for me today? Or maybe even a better question is, what stands in the way of what God has for me today? What is it inside of the things that are going to interrupt my day? See, I can get up and have all sorts of, today I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. This is only going to take me 20 minutes. This is only going to, and then you find by 10 o'clock your day has been disrupted because you got a phone call you weren't expecting. Or something that was supposed to take not so long took twice as long. But in the midst of it, to know that God's presence with us inside of each and every day. What's it look like to be faithful inside of seasons? To know that God assigns the season. We get to choose our priorities or how we respond to him in the midst of the season that we're in. If the writer of Ecclesiastes says there's a time for everything under the sun, you don't necessarily get to choose what season you're walking through. What you can choose is how you will face the season in which you're in. If it's a time of boom, is the attention going to be on you, or is it going to be back on to the one who provided blessing upon blessing? If it's a difficult season, is it going to turn your faith and your trust from God, or is it going to be a time where you find greater dependence in God? If it's a season that's unlike any other, where is your reliance and your trust found? And in the midst of it, we live in light of eternity. That if God has placed eternity inside of my heart, it should affect how I face each and every day and give grace and hope in the midst of whatever season I'm going through. I think the Christian has to have a proper perspective of kind of each of these things at all times inside of our lives. That if we just get lost in saying, I live for eternity and nothing else, you'll miss opportunities that God has for you today or the lessons he wants to teach you in the seasons. If you get stuck merely inside of the seasons of life, you'll miss the opportunities to be faithful in the moments or what God's doing in the big picture. If all you have is today, you never recognize that there's something bigger that God is doing and a story he's writing inside of your life. So as we start a new year, will you commit this next year unto him? To pretty simple question, and you're in church on January 4th, so I think most of you would probably say, yeah, that's an obvious yes. But think about it just a little bit further. These 365 days, and you've already, 3 of them are done, so 362 days. To live inside of each day for the glory of God and for what it is to trust and walk with Him. To learn maybe just to recognize that maybe what I'm going through now is just a season, and that means I need to step into it, but it also means that this will not be the ongoing story inside of my life. This will end, but I want to recognize the fact that God sometimes does His best work when He shows up inside of the difficult, the hard, the new seasons inside of my life. And to prioritize what it means to live, not just for the here and now, but with eternity in mind. There was a day when my grandma, who lived in 97, she was on hospice. She had come home, and they didn't expect that she was going to live much longer after that. She went on to live another 8 months after that. She was strong woman, and she had a full-time, there was a rotation of caregivers who were there. She was pretty much bedridden, but they made sure that she had what she needed. And at that time, my parents had passed away, so my 2 brothers and I, we would take turns, popping in. And there were a couple different times this happened, but the first time I remember the caregiver called and said, your grandmom's not doing too good. You all should come up. I don't think she has very long. So, one by one, we all made it there, and some of our other, spouses or kids came with us, and we were sitting there kind of in this, their second bedroom, because it was bigger than my grandparents' bedroom. We had kind of moved her in there. And we're all sitting around, and we're talking, and she's mostly sleeping, and an hour became 2, became 3, became 4, and you're just kind of, and some of you have been in those situations where you're just kind of sitting vigil and waiting. And after a while, my oldest brother Russ, it was I guess it was March, because he said, I want a Shamrock Shakes. Anybody else want a Shamrock Shake? Now, for the record, I did not want a I'm out on Shamrock Shakes, but I don't know if I got a Coke or a vanilla shake or whatever it was. And he said, all right, I'm going to go get Shamrock Shakes. Who wants one? And, one by one, people said some. My grandma, who had been, comatose for the past, 2.5 hours, all of a sudden said, oh, that sounds good. And at that point, I'm going to be honest, and some of you have been in this situation, there was a moment of joy, but it was also what have we been doing? We've just been, I think she just wanted us all to be there for the past, 3 or 4 hours. And so, Russ went and got Shamrock Shakes. We talked to Grandma for a little bit, and then within an hour after that, we all went home and said, I guess she's okay. And I say that to say this. It was an odd reflection. So we were, at the time, about 40 minutes from Glassboro, where she lived, heading back home. I think Rachel and I had brought 2 different cars or whatever, so I was driving by myself. And there was this reflection piece of, in a sense, there was a wasted day. And don't judge me. I love my grandma. I'm glad I was there. But it was we sat there and nothing happened. At the same time, there was this moment of this season of life that was hard, trying to be in ministry and, raise 3 young children and drive back and forth these 40 minutes to see my grandmom as much as I could to do the things. And then also, the way that she talked about eternity and being ready and almost frustrated that she hadn't met Jesus yet, there was this element, and I don't think I quite understood it at the time, that I was living in the midst of a day, a season, and eternity. And there are times where those things line up pretty well. There are times where it seems like they fight against one another. Because the things that you feel like you want to do today sometimes get punched in the face by the season in which you are, and it seems like everything is taking twice as long, or is twice as hard, or I've never been here before, or it's not going well. In the midst of all of that, God has placed eternity inside of our hearts. And He's writing a story that your day planner can't tell you, and this season of your life cannot give you an accurate picture of, but there's something much bigger that He's writing. So as we think about offering 2026 back to him, I came across this prayer from St. Teresa of Avila, who was a 16th century nun. And she wrote this, and don't think, and sorry, this is like way smaller font, but Tina's away today, so I can get away with doing this and not get yelled at. But I wanted to have the whole quote on one screen, so if this really disturbs you, just try to, put your head down or whatever, but I wanted you, if you do want to read it, I wanted you to be able to see it. Let nothing disturb you, nothing shake you. Everything passes, and God does not change. Patience obtains everything, and whoever has God lacks nothing. Our God suffices, meaning he's sufficient. Elevate your thoughts to the heavens above. Let nothing distress you, nothing disturb you. Follow Jesus Christ with a big heart, and come what may. Let nothing disturb you. I don't think what she's saying here is that nothing should bother you, just it rolls off your back, but it means nothing has the opportunity to get into that inner sanctum of where your identity and your hope is truly found. Whatever comes at this day, whatever season you find yourself in, doesn't overrule what God's doing in the eternal picture inside of your heart and inside of his kingdom. So as we come for communion, you don't have to be a member of our church. You might want to take and spend a few moments receiving communion at the altar. You might want to take it back to your seat, take it right where it's served to you. With the intention of your heart and the prayer of your heart, simply just be, God, with the moments and the days and the weeks and the months that I have, you know them. You know what lies in front of me. Would you help me to be faithful to you right where I am, inside of the day, inside of the season, and ultimately for the grand picture of what you're doing inside of eternity, inside of my heart and my life. That might mean for you surrendering a relationship. It might mean placing before God a situation. It might mean placing before him almost your carefully constructed, you've already laid out your goals for the year. That God would have impact inside of your days, inside of your seasons, ultimately inside of your eternity. So God, we would pray now that as we close our service with communion, that you would meet us here. That even for this symbolic act that for most of us we probably do 12 or 13 times a year, that you would remind us of the covenant that you've established with us. Your blood poured out for the forgiveness of our sins. Your body willingly laid down for us and for our salvation. Lord, would you renew that covenant inside of our lives today? Would you once again renew the fact that nothing would take the place of what it means to have a relationship with you and to know you? God, we invite you into our days. We invite you to continue to govern over and lead us through the seasons that we walk through. And God, we pray that more and more that you would continue to write eternity inside of our hearts. We ask and pray all this in Jesus'